I'm Bill Wilson, and along with my friend Jim Gibson, I started a little punk label called Blackout Records in 1989. Over the years, we've released records from H2O, Killing Time, Sheer Terror, Killy Rivals, Dead Guy, The New Bomb Turks, and many more. The Mad at the World podcast is a collection of conversations with our bands and extended family who have great stories to tell about their records, their art, the road, and growing up against the grain. Today on Mad at the World, we are talking to the 4 founding members of Uppercut. We all met on the Bronx campus of Fordham University, and way before they became a band and I started the label, we were just a crew of teenagers taking the D train downtown every weekend to avoid the preppy nightmare going on the Fordham campus. Hey, this is Bill from Blackout, and you're listening to the Mad at the World podcast. Today's guests are the guys from Uppercut. Steve Murphy, the singer.
How you doing, Bill?
Lars Weiss, guitar player and songwriter.
Hey, what's up, Bill?
Pat Trainer, bass player extraordinaire.
Hey, Bill, how you doing?
And Mr. Rob Sevchek on the skins.
Hi, Bill, and everyone in the hardcore world.
So we're going to dive right in and kind of just talk a little bit about, how you guys found hardcore, a little bit about how the band got together, a little band history, and, some cool anecdotes about the road. So, growing up musically, I know that, both Pat and Steve didn't grow up with rock. You guys grew up sort of listening to hip hop. And that's a really interesting musical journey for people to have, because I think traditionally, especially for myself, for the Killing Time guys, probably for Rob and for Lars, we probably came into hardcore through the rock side. So Pat, talk about growing up in Queens and kind of being exposed to hip hop and what led you to hardcore.
Yeah, sure, Bill. I mean, I grew up and went to public school in New York City, all growing up in Queens, which was pretty much, one could argue the birthplace of hip hop. Certainly I didn't live in South Jamaica, but growing up and going to public school, that's pretty much all I ever heard. I never heard a Led Zeppelin song until I went to college, or I never heard any hard rock until I went away to school. It was all hip hop growing up.
I think for me it was a little different because I grew up in Rochester, New York, and there was something about the message of hip hop that just really, really appealed to me back in the early days. With Grandmaster Flash and all that stuff, and I just dug really deep into it, even though it was not really available to me. I certainly wasn't going to any shows or anything like that, but I was buying those 12 inches at the record store downtown, and for the message of that early hip hop was it's kind of like a gateway into hardcore, and that's kind of how I got there.
So was it the social justice message really that kind of got there, and you saw kind of a comparative message in hardcore? It
was, yeah, and it was absolutely that was a big driver of it, and also just the idea of something that was sort of countercultural and not mainstream seems to always have had an appeal to me.
So was there a person, and this is for both Steve and Pat, was there a person that kind of handed you a hardcore record and said, hey, listen to this? Like, was it their specific person or people, or was it a guy from a record store? Like, how did that work?
So for me, when I was a freshman at Fordham, there's a kid down the hall who walked by, and he heard me listening to the Friday night hip hop show, and he gave me a tape, and on the tape was the Sex Pistols, which I didn't really dig that much at that time, but it also had Minor Threat and Black Flag on it, and my mind was just blown when I heard that Minor Threat record.
And Pat, how did you eventually make your way to hardcore?
I made it through kind of the skating scene. I started skating probably when I was in high school and used to go down to Washington Square Park pretty regularly. And there was a skate shop on Spring Street right off the park called Dream Wheels. And we used to see flyers for shows, and I started going to shows at Danceteria, and that's how kind of got into the scene through the skate scene.
Oh, that's cool. And then, Lars and Rob, you guys were, kind of came up in the same way that I did with like listening to rock as a kid. So Lars, you kind of went to the same record stores that Carl and I did in Yonkers because you lived basically around the corner. You were a couple years younger, I guess, than me and Carl at the time, but you went to Mad Platters and you worked at the Mad Platters record store for a little while as well. So that probably helped expand your horizons.
Yeah, I think it was mainly like, I remember hearing like, I guess I remember hearing punk rock. I remember LIR definitely played, which was like, which is a great new wave station in New York, but also played, like I remember hearing the Sex Pistols on that. And I remember also hearing it, there used to be WPIX had a radio station that was a rock station when I was little. I remember hearing that and hearing the Clash on LIR. And then through that ended up going to Mad Platters and then talking to Tony Pradlick, the guy who worked there. And that's how, I found out about hardcore and found out about Agnostic Front and things like that.
Yeah. Tony was that guy in our neighborhood really who helped. And I think on every episode where there's anybody from Westchester, whether it be Breakdown or Ordeal or now, you from Uppercut, we all, that was the nucleus of our kind of suburban scene was the record stores, whether it be Mad Platters at first or when Tony went up to work for Sue at the record stop in Hartsdale, we were all kind of, he was very influential on our shaping our musical tastes. And, I can't decide whether I should thank him or curse him for leading me down the path. But honestly, I really thank him for being, a part of it as well. So Rob, obviously, you're Queens also. And how did you like roll up into hardcore?
Kind of interesting, I think. I hope, but like when I was a kid, I'm older than all these guys. So like when I was a kid, my musical experiences were all stadium rock shows. Like, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I saw Queen with Freddie Mercury, AC/DC with Bon Scott, like some amazing stadium rock shows. But as I got older, a little bit older, like I think I just got a little bit tired of like always being like kind of in the cheap seats of like Nassau Coliseum or Madison Square Garden. And I mean, granted, I was only like around 12, 13 years old at the time, like in the mid 70s. So like, I would have to have older friends or my brothers taking me to these shows. And then at a certain point, I think the sort of pompousness of a lot of that, like sort of 70s bloated rock, like thing kind of just started wearing on me. And like my oldest brother started bringing home a few, like, he brought home like a Ramones record. He brought home a Devo record. And I was just like, whoa, wait a second. This is not Kiss. This is like some weird fucking left field shit. And like, of course I became more interested in it. And, bands like that, records like that, Ramones, Devo, Clash. And then from there, it was like kind of a natural progression to like, you start seeking out stuff that's even more intense, more punk rock, more hardcore. And then when I got to Fordham, I was probably still like, listening to a lot of rock and some metal. But like once I met Bill, once I met you and Carl, you got, we started going to matinees, et cetera. And there was something also about, the sort of immediacy of going to like a small show where you're like, oh my God, like you don't have to have a record contract to like play a show. You know what I mean? When you grew up in the 70s, it was always like you had to be signed to this big giant label. But like punk rock was just like anybody, your friends could get up and play. You could get up and play. Like it might not be that great for a while, but like it was just a completely different vibe from what I grew up with. And it was really appealing in that sense. I don't know if you guys can relate to any of that. Yeah.
That entrepreneurial aspect of hardcore really appealed to me because it was like kids were doing silk screening T-shirts. The kids were the record label. There was really very different. If a person would be in the crowd dancing for one band, and then 20 minutes later they'd be on stage singing. So I like that kind of even playing field, and as you said, less pomposity and less rock stardom, and really that sense of creativity instead of kind of the crass consumerism that kind of cock rock was. And that was really appealing to me. I think that, the DIY element of hardcore was probably the thing that resonated with me almost the most out of all the experiences that I had. What was your first show, Rob?
Like first rock show ever?
Hardcore. That
first one. You know what, man? It may have been like a band like Damage.
What, Damage at CBGB's?
I think so, man. For some reason, that really sticks in my mind, like seeing them, because it was so like blistering.
Yeah, and that record is unavailable too, and Yachty Ho is such a great song. Like they really had that sound down. Like,
wait a second. I have to throw in. I think it may have also been Reagan Youth at the Subway in Queens.
Oh wow!
That was one of the early ones as well. I remember that was a weird little club that was only around for a short amount of time, but they had some really cool bands roll through that place.
Reagan Youth was great.
Yeah, I saw them too.
Yeah, I mean, and so what year was that? What do you think? Like 85-ish, 84?
Probably. Yeah, I was definitely not a first wave hardcore guy like a lot of people I know, like Anthony from Killing Time and all.
So, Murph, what about your show? Like, how did you go from was it a Fordham thing and going to a CB's show, or like how did you ever, did somebody shepherd you down to a show once and you kind of just got caught up in the energy? Because you were a freaking rugby player, so I assumed you immediately got caught up in the energy of the whole thing.
I enjoyed it for sure. I think the first show I went to was Black Flag at Maxwell's in Hoboken.
Wow. And then they had like 85-ish?
Yeah, I think it was around 85.
Bars?
Real hardcore show was AF at CB's. And it was like one of those things, I went to it and I couldn't get in because I was 15. But I wanted to see AF, so I watched them from outside. It was AF and Underdog and Warzone.
Oh, okay. And then, Pat, how did you make it down?
My first shows were like Naked Ray Gun at Danceteria and seeing the Cramps at the Ritz. But Bill, you raised a good point. Like going to the matinees was kind of a very intimidating thing at first. And I think I did go down there with, I want to say with like Sammy Crespo or you guys. That was a very intimidating prospect at first.
Oh, so you might have come with us to our first CB show, because I remember going to see Agnostic Front and I think the Crumbsuckers, or maybe AOD or something like that, or it was the Crumbsuckers and AOD, probably sometime in 86-ish. And I remember just being completely intimidated because I'm there wearing my ridiculous homemade Suicidal Tendency shirt like any suburban hardcore kid would. And I'm getting these fucking stare downs from all these like, Billy Psycho and all of these like, dudes that were, to me as, an 18-year-old, college freshman, these were all like giant freaking adults. And then, Big Charlie at the door, who is, he's like makes Lawrence Taylor look like Billy Barty, as far as like size wise, he was freaking humongous. And then I just remember Troy, coming down, bald head, safety pins literally all over his thing. And he was carrying the thigh bone of like a side of beef. Like he was carrying just like this basically cudgel made out of like this thigh bone. He must have just got it on the West Side or something like that. But like, and I was just thinking to myself, like, I was completely intrigued and I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And it was great and it was exhilarating, but it was also very fucking intimidating, you know?
It was, Bill, and you really forget. I mean, you go to New York City now, and it's so gentrified. Back then, I mean, the Lower East Side, particularly where CB's was on the lower end of the Bowery, was a rough little spot back then.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely there were times of, you know, violence. I remember, you know, like the guys, you know, in the hotel over CB's throwing, you know, beer bottles full of piss down at people, and then Charlie handing out pool cues for us to like fight them. Like that was like one matinee show, the early matinee show that I remember. And then all of a sudden hearing the cops come and then like 100 hardcore kids running the wrong way down Bleecker over cars and into the subways and scattering like fucking cockroaches when you turn the light on. Like, and that kind of shit definitely doesn't happen anymore, you know, because of surveillance, because of the way the neighborhood is gentrified, and just because it's definitely a different time now. I'll tell you that much. But yeah, so, you know, did all of you play instruments prior to kind of to putting the band together? Did all of you play, or was it just kind of like you just kind of bought instruments to participate in hardcore?
I think it was the latter. I think we all sort of had well, I don't know. I had a little bit of experience with playing, but by no means was I like a musician at that point. And I don't know if these guys feel the same way.
Yeah, it was the same thing. I played for a little bit. I think Carl and I shared a guitar teacher when I was really young. And yeah, but I by no means was like a musician or ever was one.
And then
I think it was more we were just making a pact to like be sort of a semi quasi gang or something.
Pat, when did you pick up the bass?
I picked up the bass. I used to kind of Rob had a drum set in his dorm in a little thing, and we'd go to his dorm room and play that first Murphy's Law album, and we just make a lot of noise. I don't know if you remember that, Rob.
I do remember. There were no cymbals, just drums.
Right.
And we would just blast that shit and just literally bounce off the walls. And then when the SOD record came out, that pissed a lot of people off too. Yeah. But I could never play. Lars was always very patient with me. Lars would just like, all right, Pat, put your finger on this fret, then that fret. And that's how I learned. So I was always very grateful for Lars' patience.
Well, you know, I mean, somebody had to be the musician. And then, so all of you guys were kind of barely playing. Steve, did you had any idea that you were ever going to be a vocalist for a band?
Definitely not. Zero. I don't even know how. I still don't know how it happened.
You still don't believe that you're a singer? Is that really what's going on?
I mean, that's definitely true. But I think to me, it was almost like a sport, you know. I mean, just being on stage and just having that amount of violence going on, it was just like playing rugby.
Yeah, I mean, the look on your face always doing shows was this look of complete reckless abandon. So yeah, like you were having fun, like tossing people around. It was kind of like an adrenaline rush for you, you know, at that time. And I don't think you really were like thinking about your vocal intonation as much as you were kind of just looking to scream and friggin' rip it up.
Absolutely.
So Uppercut, getting together, right? Everybody's kind of like focused around Fordham or people at Fordham, right? And, you know, I guess Carl was probably the catalyst for a lot of this. Yeah,
definitely. Blame it all on Carl, man. No, all kidding aside, no, I mean, I met Lars through Carl. Carl remembers too, the day we met was, you know, the day that it was the day that we were both like, I think waiting online to buy Rain and Blood. and we, I think I met you that same day too, Bill. Anyway. Yeah. And Carl was like, oh, you have a drum set, you know? Oh, really? Like, and then he introduced me to Lars, and he was like, well, why don't you guys don't just keep coming to see us. I think he was like, yeah, why don't you guys try to do something? We were like, oh shit, all right. And yeah.
And then you kind of got together probably at Lars's house to kind of practice a little bit, and then you had to pick a vocalist. And so, you went through a couple of different choices, right? I think Sam Crespo was your initial vocalist, but it wasn't kind of set in stone, and then he kind of faded. And then you all knew this guy from around campus, right? This intense person. So I know that, there was a nickname for Steve that I don't think he really knew. But you guys decided, that you were going to invite him to try out. So Pat, pull that thread a little bit.
I sure will. I used to see it, and guys, Fordham was a pretty small community, and I think there was a bunch of us who were kind of either into skating or music, and we kind of could had like a secret nod or something, or a secret handshake to identify each other. But I used to see Steve a lot around town with the girl he was dating back then. And my name for Steve was Mr. Hate. I was always very intimidated by him.
And then, so who was the person who actually approached Steve about trying out? And Murph, what did you think when they asked you?
Steve, I think I asked you, and I think you just laughed in my face.
I definitely remember Rob asking me, but he was very like, you can try out. And I was like, okay, I'll try out.
You can try.
Because I think there was a guy named Walter who was kind of in the mix too at that time, and there was like a little competition going on. So when I went down there the first time into Lars's basement, I definitely didn't think I had the job. I was just going to kind of try out. I remember being actually quite nervous about it. And
then lo and behold, you became the singer of Uppercut. So you guys wrote a bunch of songs, right? Probably in that practice space up at Lars's in Westchester. And then, you kind of followed the same kind of Killing Time template. I think you recorded a demo first, right? And then Where the Wild Things Are followed soon thereafter. And the timeline is pretty gray for me. Do you guys remember kind of the whole timeline? Like, where you recorded, how you recorded, all that kind of stuff?
The demo we recorded in Yonkers, right?
Yeah, we recorded that at the Loft.
At the Loft. And
Yeah.
the guy was like a total deadhead, and like, and he was just like, you could tell he was like, why did I even let these fucking guys use it? But he was patient, and the sounds were good. The songs I don't think were really that strong, but as we were saying before, we were learning as we went.
I think that demo marks my only appearance of ever writing lyrics for a song.
That's true.
Could be.
Yep, you definitely wrote the lyrics to I can't remember what song it was now, but I remember you handed me a piece of paper with all the lyrics written down. You're like, I just need you to do this.
I had no place doing that either. There was no authority that I carried. I was just like, I wrote this. Do you want to use it or something like that? Like it was just 18-year-old catharsis.
Well, that goes to the access of the hardcore scene. You didn't need any right. You just did it.
Yeah, that was part of the magic of that. So on the heels of doing that demo, I guess I was in the process of putting together Where the Wild Things Are, because I started putting that together, I guess, junior year at Fordham, maybe senior year at Fordham. Probably the song that everybody knows is the song that's on the compilation, Am I Clear? And I know that, from the way you guys looked and from the way you guys kind of sounded, people probably thought that you were a straight edge band. And while, Pat was pretty, straight edge, if not straight edge, Steve definitely wasn't. And I think you guys kind of exemplified kind of, a blend. And that song was definitely not a straight edge song. So Steve, can you kind of talk about what those lyrics are about and kind of debunk some of the mythology around that?
Yeah, I don't really view that song as being about straight edge. To me, that song was more a reflection on what was going on in the scene at that time. Because, when I got into the New York hardcore scene, it was about all these kids who were different. They felt a little outside of their societies. And a lot of these kids were from high school, or, they were younger than me, a little bit younger anyway. And it just dawned on me one day at the matinee that for all of this talk about this group of people that was kind of unifying together because they were all freaks. And I took a look around, and you had the straight edge kids who basically looked like jocks, right? They were wearing varsity jackets and Air Jordans. And then you had the metalhead kids who were, dressed like, well, they always dress the same, right? They still dress the same with the black t-shirts. And then you had the other various groups, and everybody had their uniform. And, this is probably, I don't know, 88 maybe. And it was just kind of just a very, I just had like a kind of a moment. That song was like a flash of lightning, really. It came together in one practice. I think both the music and the words came together in one practice. And so it was more of it was just more of a statement of, we were here because we were all, different from the typical society norms. And yet, when you looked around, people were just starting to kind of fall back into their usual roles, and I didn't like that. So I picked straight edge because at that time, the straight edge guys I felt were really kind of trying to differentiate themselves from everybody else at CBGB's. And I never really thought about this much until I read an interview with Jules from Side by Side, I never knew that the reason that Jules started Alone in a Crowd with Rob and Lars and Carl was that because he also had very similar feeling. Maybe not as direct as my feeling was, but I think it just struck a note with me, and that's where the lyrics just came out.
Are there any other songs that kind of have that special meaning? Because for me, I know, especially as you got into doing different stuff like doing Mind's Eye, there seemed to be a spiritual element, and I don't want to say like religious element, but there seemed to be a little tiny dash of a spiritual element coming into some of your songs.
Uppercut was never, Rob, I think touched on this in one of our conversations, but Uppercut was never, we weren't really we were very different than the normal bands in that scene at that time. Like even the music was always kind of lending itself to something else. In the later songs, some of which were never recorded, were already heading in like a post-hardcore direction. And there was just always some melody in the music, which, was, there wasn't a lot of melody in hardcore back in those days. Right. So, I just think it was, I think when you start bringing melody into music, you end up having more emotion in the vocals. It just happens naturally.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because you guys didn't have traditional like mosh parts, and you did have some, but aside from Where the Wild Things Are stuff, where it was a little bit more of a traditional song. When you listen to the EP, when you get to the songs on the EP, there's a lot of multiple layers, and it probably has to do with the musical influences, probably circa 89, right? It comes from the fact that you guys weren't just listening to, mosh it up hardcore. At that point in New York City, there was a lot of different things starting to crop up, right? It was the rise of Amphetamine Reptile. It was the rise of, probably, the first wave of Sub Pop pre-Nirvana. And it was before kind of the, real freak rock explosion of Faith No More and Jane's Addiction. But in New York, there was a lot of these departures happening.
Yeah. Even take a band like Prong, Prong for as hard as they were, Prong had a ton of really cool shit going on in those early albums. And then you started to get like bands like Helmet coming through, and just changed for me anyway.
Yeah, and that's also why, on my side, I signed bands like Crawl Pappy because they were kind of like what I considered to be like hardcore phase 2, which is like dudes that were a little bit older, right? They knew how to play their instruments a little bit. Their songwriting was intense, but their lyrics were still, emotionally driven, personally introspective lyrics, but heavy as fuck.
But you talk lyrically, I think from the EP, The Machine Breaks Down, which, guys, did Drago write that? Does that sound right?
Eric
did.
Fink wrote it.
Fink. Oh, okay. I thought it was
Eric wrote like every part of that. Yeah.
Okay, but that was lyrically, that was a very haunting song.
Oh, I was just going to say that when I think about the EP, a lot of it, and having listened to it later on, a lot of that is Eric, who's, his playing and his influence on it. Like, there's a lot of stuff that he did that was, for a hardcore band, a little bit out of the box. And that's the thing that when I listen to it now, later on, that I really appreciate, that maybe even then I might have thought was a little too out there. But like Eric, he's a really good guitar player. And that made some of the stuff like way different. And, I've always like really grown to appreciate his influence on that. Eric was like doing stuff that he couldn't do in Side by Side or in a regular hardcore band by the time he was playing with us. He is like definitely like a huge thing of what makes that record sound different and made the band sound different is him. It was just my playing. There's no way it would sound that way.
Well, I mean, was he the Greg Ginn of Uppercut in some ways?
There's a lot of notes, though. There's a lot of notes. He's not stopping playing.
He was probably more advanced, like way more advanced than we were as players.
Yeah. Yeah.
He had that badass BC Rich too.
Definitely.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He also probably wouldn't have been able to play a lot of that stuff in any other New York hardcore bands at that time.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's like there's no way that was going to happen in a regular youth crew like hardcore band that he was in. The ones he was in. He was in Side by Side and Gorilla Biscuits before he was with us.
Yeah, I think we were kind of like we were always pretty open to to different stuff and it was almost like anything goes, like maybe to our detriment at times. Maybe we should have been a little more discriminating, but we threw it all in the pot.
Definitely tried. Yeah. It's a weird record. I like the EP. It's definitely doesn't sound like any other hardcore record from that time. It's weird. And I like it. And most of it, what I really like the most out of it is Eric's playing is insane. It's really good.
How did you guys hook up with him? Because, we were talking about him on the EP, but we didn't really kind of talk about his joining of the band. So when did that happen and how did you connect with him?
But the whole thing happened is that I got, I don't know how I met Sammy, but I met Sammy, I think through my brother, who's like, my younger brother is Sammy's age. And he knew a friend of his and I met those guys, or I might have met him through, I don't know who it was. And then I ended up, through Sammy, I met Jules and they were like, oh, we need a bass player. Billy's leaving the band. And I was like, oh, I'll do it. And so I ended up playing with Side by Side on the side for a little bit. I played one show with them and then they broke up. And then Eric, I became friends with Eric because Eric's the guy that taught me all the Side by Side songs. I would hang out with him. And then after that, I was just like, I'm doing this other band. Do you want to come up to my mom? I think he just showed up at my mom's house and we just did it. And he ended up playing and that was it. He was in the band right after that. It was not very planned or anything, but I think that was pretty much it. I enjoyed hanging out with Eric and I also knew Eric was friends with my friend Hugh. I don't know if I knew Hugh through Eric. It's all weird. And anyway, and so I was just like, oh, we ended up hanging out all the time. And then he ended up coming up to my house and then he practiced with us once and then he started playing in the band. And that's how, so here's a side-by-side connection.
Yeah. It always happens by osmosis, it appears, in most hardcore bands. It's just kind of like, hey, this guy's around and he's good and he played and this is cool.
Yeah.
Look,
But he also had some notoriety. I remember him. Wasn't he on the cover of a Revelation comp or something?
Yeah, he's on the cover. The inside cover for the booklet,
right?
For The Way It Is. He's the picture. He's playing bass. That's when he played bass in Gorilla Biscuits,
right?
And he played bass in Gorilla Biscuits before Arthur did. So, because he grew up with Lukey, him and Lukey know each other from they were little kids. They both grew up in the same part. They grew up in downtown Brooklyn. And so he was in Gorilla Biscuits from almost not the very beginning, but very close once Lukey was playing with them. And then, anyway, that's what that picture is from, is when he played bass for Gorilla Biscuits. And, I think the side-by-side show I played with was with Gorilla Biscuits, and I think he played both. And that was the last Gorilla Biscuits show he played, I think. That was around 87 or something like that. I don't really remember. It's sort of weird. You have to ask him. That's like part 2. We can track down Eric Fink.
That's right.
So EP comes out. You know, you guys were playing shows all along. A lot of times because eventually Carl became roommates with Steve on and off, you know, in this dilapidated apartment off adjacent to the Fordham campus that we used to call the Hotel Camberling. You know, it was this, you know, it was, you know, and everybody would call it the hotel and we knew exactly what it was. And, you know, that was the place where we had kind of, you know, our post-college now parties, and, you know, it was kind of the centerpiece for, you know, a lot of, you know, probably that, you know, late 80s, early 90s shenanigans, because Steve had graduated and Rob had graduated a couple of years before us. So I think Carl was probably moved in when his parents moved to Florida. That was the place where many a road trip was launched from. You know, and I think all of us had probably some of the best times and some of the most memorable times, you know, not playing the particular shows, but just doing the things that we did. And one of the things that stands out in my memory is like the friggin' completely insane way that we all used to travel, you know, by, you know, Communale renting a panel truck with all of us cramming into the back, with like throwing a couch back there and all the amps completely untethered.
Yep.
You know, just like everybody just sitting in this open, you know, living room in the back, unventilated. I remember coming back from Boston once feeling really high because apparently the exhaust was going into the cabin and we all could have died of asphyxia. You know, I remember once coming back from Boston and I think Allie and Lucia were both like, we feel really woozy. And I'm like, and once they opened the door and we actually got oxygen, we all felt invigorated. And apparently it was because we were, you know, we had we were getting suffocated by the exhaust and we didn't know it.
You always had the seat in the van that was the most dangerous, that someone would call the Cliff Burton seat. Like you'd have to be sitting on like a milk crate or some shit like that, like in the middle of.
Riding Burton.
Yep.
Riding Burton. It's like, I'm just gonna get crushed. Like if we go down, I'm in the worst position.
Yeah, somebody will be jettisoned immediately out of the vehicle. And then we also used to rent vans from this shitty place in Yonkers called Norman's Used Auto Rentals, where I believe the slogan was "Where less is more." And it was probably the only. It was Norman's Used Auto Rentals, where less is more. And I
really wish I had a Norman's T-shirt.
Oh, so do I, because it was like the quintessential like slippery used car dealership in South Yonkers. But hey, as under 25-year-olds, you know, it was probably one of the few places that we could rent. But I distinctly remember one of the road trips where it was Outburst and Uppercut. It wasn't Killing Time. And I remember we were playing DC, maybe the Safari Club. I don't really remember. Maybe it was the Worcester
Safari Club
Hall. And, you know, Leadfoot Murphy fucking pulls the thing all the way down 95 to DC. And then, you know, we start coming home and the tranny starts slipping. And at that point, we were like, I think we just went to a Pizza Hut or something terrible. And
yeah, it wasn't. Yeah,
I think literally everyone lost their minds at that point. At some point that night, you know, we had. I think that was a pretty crazy trip. So I thought we were going to take the auto train, but that only went up to DC, so that wasn't helpful. We probably should have burned the thing and just left it there, but then the equipment would have been staying there too.
Yeah.
But, you know, I just remember the solution to the problem was very interesting. Does somebody want to take the rest of the story on?
And then the solution was, when we decided we weren't going to just bail and like call up and say the van got stolen, when we couldn't figure that out, we decided to get it towed with us in it to go drop it off back at the rental spot, and ended up, it was also cold.
Yep.
It was freezing, and it was, definitely remember like having like, it was like it took forever. It was a really, in classic Uppercut style, it was a really good show. We turned a win into an L somehow because the show was really good, but I think, ending up having to get home that way kind of put a damper on how, the night that we did have. That was just it was a crazy. And then I think what we did is we took shifts riding back in the cab up front with the weird like driver, the tuk-tuk driver, and then everyone else sat in the back like at a 45-degree angle for all the way home.
We basically sat in an ice box for like 9 hours, and the tow truck driver Lars kicked you out of the front because you kept falling asleep.
Oh, because I fell asleep. Yeah. Well, it was all cozy. Like you went from like being so freezing to like it was like toasty and warm in there. I just passed the fuck out. I was like, oh my God, this is so nice. I was like,
these two truck drivers were also hillbilly as fuck. Like they probably shared one tooth. Like they would just hand it back and forth. Like
that's the other thing I remember learning about is like once you get into suburban Virginia, it is kind of the South still. Like DC is its own thing, and then everything outside of it, you're still in the South.
It was Jessup, Virginia. I'll never forget it. And we've driven by it on tour in Kings Destroy, literally probably 50 times since then, and I still see it every time we're on the road, and I'm just like, it gives me PTSD, to be honest with you.
well
everybody lost their mind during that thing. I just remember me and Steve looking at each other and just cackling because of the horror, just laughing, just being like, this is so horrible. Like just laughing because as I recall, the prison van, by the way, that's what we were traveling in.
Yeah, it was a prison van.
It wasn't
insulated.
Like Westchester County. It was just, and the back door had been like jimmied open. So like there was like 10-degree air just blasting in all over us for the entire trip back. Sefcek, you were a vegetarian at the time, and I believe you housed an entire leftover pepperoni pizza.
Yeah, that trip destroyed my vegetarianism.
And like
I realized that when you were cold and dying, that pepperoni was actually helpful.
Cold and dying. Yeah.
No, but there's so many classic bad hardcore band road trips that, and that one, whenever I talk to people who've had like crazy things happen, I think that one, it doesn't take the cake, but it definitely sits up there with like, I once sat in the back of our van getting towed back to DC and like from DC, and it was like 15 degrees out, and they're just like, oh.
It took a really long time because we had to take side roads. We also had to stay down. Right. We also had, because if cops saw us, they would have pulled us over, and then we would have been fucked on the side of the road. And then Koo and Klux would have gotten a huge ticket, the two drivers, which is why we had named them after we returned.
I'll never forget coming down Fordham Road at daybreak, at dawn, because we literally were traveled all night in that thing. And we had to stop. Bill stopped at the cash machine to drain the Blackout bank balance so we could pay these guys, and we got back, and it was $600, and we gave the guy $600, and he was absolutely furious with us because when we were negotiated when we first started, he was like, "There's going to be a tip on the end here," and we just didn't. We had no money. We barely had the $600, and he was just infuriated with us. After the all-nighter, and I just remember it was right in front of the hotel, and I went inside and I called Norman's and left a message just saying the van broke down because you were not allowed to take Norman's vans out of state. So of course
that's right.
We took the vans out of state every single weekend, right? That's why we couldn't leave it down there, because if I couldn't just say, "Oh, it broke down in Washington D.C.," because they'd be like,
"Yeah,
you just bought it."
Yeah, then it's less is more. Then you own it. Like you're.
Yeah, that was the pinnacle. I think that was definitely the pinnacle of shitty times on the road with you guys. But it does create a rather amusing anecdote, and it definitely does take well, maybe not the gold. It definitely is a medalist in the pantheon of shitty road stories. It definitely is. But there are definitely more. Like, we stayed in some pretty hovelish conditions. And, I remember another road trip to Boston, potentially without Killing Time again. It seemed like not going with Killing Time really always was like the catalyst for something shitty happening. We went up to Boston, and then we were offered to stay at this skinhead girl's house. And then we were shown to this like linoleum floored bedroom with one giant like normal mattress on it. Like, all right, here's where you can sleep. With her, it was like a Marge Simpson style voice that she had. And, the evening just got better from there.
Yeah, we had Boston always had great parties after the shows. Remember, we used to we'd have a great party at somebody's house, and then we would have to find someplace to crash. And I just remember we met these girls at the party, and they all had names, but not like normal names. Like one was called Adidas, I remember. And this is how old we are, but they were all like phone sex workers. That's how they made their money.
That's right.
And they're like, you can come back and stay with us. And we're like, okay. And we did. And it was one bedroom that two girls were crashing in, and we had to sleep on the floor. And it was filthy, just a filthy place, right?
Oh, it was horrible. I remember like being I think we were festooned in cockroaches, like for a while. And we were all just sitting there like, ugh. And then we were talking. And then at some point during the evening, the door flew open, like with this silhouette of this furious skinhead girl, who proceeded to tell us that she was going to kill all of us in our sleep. And then if you recall, I won't say this, but you guys may want to chime in on, I had a rather uncivil reaction to that particular response.
I think it was classic Bill Wilson reaction, wasn't it? It was like, why don't you just fucking put me out of my misery right now? Go ahead, kill me. Go get a knife.
Yeah. You made yourself a sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, I still to this day, when I reflect upon some of those things, I really wondered what the fuck I was so mad at 20-something years of age. I just cannot, literally for the life of me, I can't recall what my problems were, but, it definitely, I definitely had a little air of negativity around me.
Oh, yeah, you did, Bill. Yeah, you did.
I think it was all that sheer terror and carnivore you were listening to.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I just I can't really put my finger on it now, and I've had a couple years of therapy, and I still don't really understand where that was.
It's funny that the guy who wasn't in the band was the saltiest guy that we knew.
Yeah.
And you know what? That feels actually pretty good coming from Mr. Haight.
Yeah. It's a ringing endorsement. I just want to know, where did I sleep at that house? Because I have no recollection. I think I would have remembered something that horrific.
You probably. It was very memorable. Like, I know it was Murph. I know it was Sefchek. I know it was me.
Yeah, I was definitely in there.
Pat, I think were you there, Pat?
Yeah, absolutely. Lars, I think you were in school at that time.
Yeah.
I think you might have been in school.
But
so you might have flown the coop out of Rochester.
No,
that's a good miss, dude.
I had a calculus test or something like that. But
I think that was the weekend that we did a mini tour with DI, because we played. We were on the road to Albany. We played Boston, then we played Albany, some VFW hall in Albany the day after.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely missed that. Yeah, I would have remembered playing with DI.
So was Fink the only guitar player at that point?
No.
Yeah.
At that show, you just had Fink was the stand-in?
I think it was Seawolf by then. No?
Oh.
No, I don't think so. It was wild that, Eric, when you were in school, it was just Eric and I and Rob and you, Steve.
Oh, yeah, there were some special shows with you two guys.
Wow.
Oh.
Yeah, that's just pretty much drums and vocals for most of the for a good chunk of the show.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pat and Eric would just
when
be
the bass player and the guitar player are both in the like stage diving like all the time, like it sort of leads to like not tight playing.
No.
You know?
The thing is, Pat being, you know, he's not as slender as he used to be, but Pat used to be very easy to throw around. So it was great.
Yes.
Like you could pick up Pat and like throw him into the crowd, and he'd be like sitting there with this big shit-eating grin on, getting thrown like 10 feet into the crowd, playing bass and like stepping on people's heads. Like, so what Pat may have made up for in not being Matt Freeman from Rancid on the bass playing side, he definitely did friggin' make up for it in pure showmanship.
Oh, it was so much fun.
Yeah.
It was so much fun.
I'll never forget, like, Todd, like, he would, like, gently put his bass down, like, and then just, like, roll up his sleeves and yeah, like you said, have that big shit-eating grin and, like, jump into the audience.
Yeah, when you guys did Dirty Deeds in Boston, which all you guys were doing, I just remember, number one, it didn't really sound like Dirty Deeds, but it sounded close enough. But, like, didn't somebody else pick up the bass who didn't really know the song literally at all?
I routinely gave the bass to somebody, whoever was standing next to me.
It was Zach from Maelstrom.
It's fucking great. It's literally just like, sure, you kind of know it, maybe not. Just play it. Who knows?
Yeah, that guy could play.
Yeah, he was good. He could definitely play.
Oh, I don't recall. I don't really recall that song having. I don't really recall the audio fidelity or the adherence to the arrangement in that particular rendition of Dirty Deeds.
No.
Hey, there's a great there's a cool YouTube vid of that on up in I think the show you're talking about, and it actually sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Does it really? I gotta go back and watch. I really do.
Man, it's complete chaos. I'm amazed that we were able to get through the song. Because it was pretty chaotic.
It was a mess, but Boston was always fun. I think Boston liked you better than New York. I mean, the Slapshot guys kind of adopted you a little bit. They were always at your shows. They were always talking, like between Jack and Mark and Jamie and everybody. Like they were up front, fucking dancing for you guys all the time. Like it was actually pretty cool. Like they always were good supporters, and Pat Moran, who was their roadie. As well, was like, you know, those guys were great to us. You know, Boston was like a second home. Like, you know, bullshit rivalries be damned. Slapshot were fucking aces to you guys and to Killing Time, frankly.
Yeah, man. Wrecking Crew too, man. Keith Bennett and John Darga and all those dudes, man. They were always
Wrecking Crew guys were all fucking awesome. Like, yeah, Boston was great. You know,
Eye for an Eye guys too.
I think it might have been because since we weren't I don't think any of us personally were in that first wave of hardcore, that when we went to Boston, it was kind of like they just kind of accepted us for who we were. Like we didn't have like a reputation or anything yet. But they were just cool, you know? Not that New York wasn't, but it was like, I don't know.
Well, there's no pre-existing beef from like,
exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Kind of like a new era.
Yeah, it's a whole different generation of kids. Like I remember going up to with Killing Time played with Sick of It All in Boston. It was one of the first times that Sick of It All had played in Boston, and everyone was like slightly worried that as being a New York band there. And then it was just like, well, it's kind of like nothing happened, and everyone was super cool because it was a completely different generation of kids that didn't like, you know, I mean the Slapshot guys, and they were from then, but they didn't care. They're like, you guys were like in, you know, high school when that or even going to shows when that happened. So they were always super, super nice.
Yeah. And like we had some good times, like even though like I also remember, you know, playing at the Blue Pelican with SNFU, you know, going with you guys to
and Slapshot.
Yeah. And that was Slapshot and SNFU. And you know, but those were the kind of things that I'll remember because that was this hot summer day, and before the show, I think like half of us went swimming. Like, like me, that's Carl, Al, Lars, like we all were like went swimming off of Newport, and like we're jumping off this friggin' ridiculously high bridge into the water and swimming over. Like those are the kind of things that you kind of remember as like the Tom Sawyer kind of moments of like doing this crazy, like shit. Like that's part of the joy of being on the road that, you know, I don't know if people still get at this point, but it sure was fun.
That's also, yeah, they just have like on hot summer. I remember like on the Judge tour that I did, there was like part of the tour once we got past the Mississippi that we were like, we're going swimming every day, no matter what. Like we would go like to hotel pools. We went swimming I went swimming in a river. Like it was like you had you just wanted to, like, it was totally Tom Sawyer. It's like the same thing. You're like, oh, it's a nice day and we're hot in this van. Let's just go jump off the Newport Bridge.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The low part, by the way, the high part, we would have been smeared.
Yeah.
But
No, that would have been like a different story. That's the low part. Yeah. That bridge is not there anymore. They changed it out. They swapped it out.
Oh, really? Oh, I guess it's like the Tappan Zee.
It's the same thing. They did the same thing. They built the bridge next to it, and yeah, it's not there anymore. But yeah.
Yeah. I always liked Newport after that. I always thought it was like a cool place. I've never actually been back since then. But that was, I think, where I first met Brian Simmons as well.
Yeah. I still am in touch with him all the time. Like I just see it, I see him all the time and have stayed in touch with him from that. I think that we met him because I think they wanted to book Raw Deal for that, and then they couldn't. And then that was also a Carl thing that he was just like, oh, you should link up with this guy. And he did. Or he saw us play with Killing Time and was like, it was Raw Deal then. And then, it's become a lifelong friend just from, he booked us for that show, and I've stayed in touch with him ever since.
Yeah, I mean, and he's put out some great records and like become a really good friend, and so, a lot of shows, a lot of things, can't cover all the shenanigans and road trips here. But, the thing I remember is that, towards the end phase of Uppercut, everybody's kind of adult crash hit a little bit. Like I remember, Steve was starting to work a full-time job. And like he would come home after a night of like playing shows and probably driving half, if not all the way home from a place like Boston. We get home at fucking sunup, and Steve would literally go hop in the shower, suck down 3 Cokes, and then like throw on his suit and go to work at Merrill Lynch. Like, dude, your energy level was just remarkable then, to do that. But that's kind of like, I guess that's the point where you guys really decided that, there were certain things that were unsustainable, and the band kind of was just kind of, not something you could do anymore in that same way. So talk about kind of like where you guys were probably circa, 91, in your heads.
Like hardcore had sort of become, like, at least the hardcore that I grew up with and going to like matinees at CB's and things like that became something else. It became like hyper violent, to put it mildly. And then also like, then the whole ABC No Rio thing happened, which wasn't really my cup of tea. I don't think was anyone. So like all of a sudden you were in this band you're in a band that related to a certain scene or a certain environment, and that environment isn't there anymore. And that sort of made it adds to like what you're, going through personally, where you're like, I want to do something different, or whatever. You have like, a real job or whatever. Or at that point I was like in college, I was younger than everybody else, but like things are changing. So you just don't, those two things working together really made you not interested in doing it anymore. The change in the scene really, I think one or the other you could get past. If the scene had sort of stayed like as it's sort of interesting and not really as crazy as New York became, you might want to have stuck it out. It would probably change. The music would have changed, and you could have just dealt with the other. But the two of those things together, I've always thought about is like that's when I stopped playing in hardcore bands, because it was just like it was something else at that point.
Yeah, and that's when hardcore got a little trite and boring for me, because it was the same old thing. And musically, I said this the other day on a different episode, but all these satellite scenes in suburbia started, popping up. And so, you had a couple of scenes, different scenes in New Jersey, right, that didn't rely on New York City anymore. New York wasn't the mecca for freakazoid culture that it used to be, and the music in New York was its own little crazy bubble with, again, that at that point, alternative rock was in full glory. Matador was in full glory with Pavement and Guided by Voices. And even I did a Guided by Voices record early on in the 90s on my other label. And, there was this musical explosion that, one could argue that the kernel comes from punk rock and hardcore, right? But it really just kind of branched out to where all these different styles were happening, and the social scene downtown was just incredible. When you look at all the bars that were opening, it was like a debauched circus, and I loved it down there. But it definitely was different than hardcore, and it was definitely, and I was not. Again, much like you, Lars, I was definitely not into the ABC No Rio scene, only because they kind of stood against my friends. They were derided Sick of It All. They derided Killing Time. There was this whole kind of, what I consider to be faux privileged anti-money thing that was going on, like, fuck you, fuck the system, man, and it just seemed to be, a little different than, the spirit of DIY that I had thought, and me personally, I like to see my friends be able to, maybe make a living from the art instead of having to work in a factory all day. Like, there's nothing noble in having to slog your life away. And it seemed like, these guys were kind of, pissing in the face of that, and it turned me off. And then, as you said, also the incredible violence that was happening at shows, like, I think Anthony's big joke is, hey, I went to a fist fight and a show broke out, and it was kind of like, that was something like, at that point, my anger had dissipated enough to where that wasn't cool anymore. Like, I wanted to, like, hang out, watch rock, and talk to girls. I had no desire to, like, beat down who.
And at one point, CB's just like stopped. They were just like, we're not doing this anymore. And that was, I don't know when that happened. I'd already not been going, but like, it got so bad that they were just like, we can't do this. And something's bad when, like, venues are just like, we'll pass.
I remember, I remember being at a matinee once, and there was a fight that started inside, which was not all that uncommon, that spilled outside. And one of the guys pulled out a gun right in front of CB's.
Yeah.
And we were all like, we were all like, right, like, what the fuck is this?
This is crazy. This is not something I'm really psyched about right now.
Right. That's right, Lars. That's right.
Yeah, that's not where I go to shows, right? It's definitely not part of the ethos that I had. Like, it's just something that, it's not something that I wanted hardcore to be. And I know that it's not up to my control to figure out how, the nobility of the genre or the purity of the genre. So I kind of just found my own path, and, putting out different records by bands like the Goops, or even doing God Is My Co-Pilot, starting the Engine label where I did other things. I was working for different record companies at the time, like indie record companies. I ran a heavy metal label called Earache for a couple of years. And so, like, these were the kinds of things where that was all happening in New York City. So while I think that in my head I was still DIY and still kind of hardcore in some ways, I wasn't such a fascist about kind of adhering to, one sort of brand for myself. And it was just kind of like, I do what the fuck I want. And, I appreciated that. And you guys were kind of the same way, where, we didn't have to be purists in that way anymore. And, Steve, you started a couple different bands. Lars, you were in a couple of different bands as well, like side projects, like Alone in the Crowd. Rob, you were in a gajillion fucking different bands, from, going from all the way from, Electric Frankenstein and Fur, all the way through, you and Steve are now in King's Destroy. So the music element hasn't changed. But everybody kind of got jobs. Everybody did stuff. And that's where kind of Uppercut kind of was a point in time.
I think we really hit a big crossroads there. And by the way, shout out to Lars, who, as a teenager, handled all of the logistics of the band. Like, I didn't book any shows. I didn't I didn't handle anything. I don't think Rob, maybe Pat might have done a little bit too, but Lars booked every single show. And we got to this point in 1990 where we were probably as big as we definitely went out as big as we were, right? There was no down trade, but I think that Lars was able to get a full U.S. tour offer and possibly U.S. and Europe. And, that was just a big crossroads for the band. We were already kind of a little bit negative on some of the final shows we played, not in terms of audience, but just like, what are we doing? Maybe we were a little burned out. And I remember going into my boss and saying, I'd like to take a 3-month leave of absence unpaid. And he's like, why? And I said, I'm in this band, because I had hidden all that from my work. And the guy was just like, this is your crossroads. He's like, you're either working here or you're quitting. So, and at that time, I couldn't even, my rent was $200 in the Bronx. I could not even imagine making $200 a month in hardcore and Uppercut to pay my rent. And I certainly wasn't moving back in with my folks. So it was a pretty easy decision for me, I guess.
Yeah. Because New York City rents, even though they might have been not very expensive at the time, were still like, people still had to pay to live if you weren't like able to crash at your parents. Like, and your family was up in fucking Rochester, and it's not like they were going to welcome you back so you could play in a hardcore band. So,
just wasn't an option.
I was so impressed with the hotel's ease of I don't know, the rent on that place being what it was. I mean, I always tell people, because even then, I mean, I remember I had a place in Soho. Like I lived on McDougal Street and Prince Street, which Carl moved into after he lived in the hotel. And that was affordable. And I always remember thinking, well, like, my bedroom there was $475 a month. And I remember like thinking, well, the Bronx is like even like so low, like so crazy. I don't know, I always remember thinking like how living like that is just not available now, and especially maybe in that neighborhood. But even now, I think that neighborhood has changed so much that's incredibly expensive.
Well, that's why the culture of creativity in New York is gone in a lot of different places, because there's nowhere for artists or ne'er-do-wells to like live. Like, where's somebody going to live? You're going to like, live, I guess maybe the ass end of Bushwick, but even that's fucking expensive.
Hey guys, I had this thought since we last talked, and you talk about, the scene in New York City. I'm sure you guys remember when we and pretty much every other band in New York City used to practice at Giant on West 14th Street. And remember, guys, like, we'd go in and practice in those god-awful, shitty rooms. We'd book 2 hours, and then when you're done, you'd go next door and you'd listen to the guys from Underdog for like, 20 minutes or whatever other band, but you ran into, other bands in there constantly. I mean, it was such, it was just a really magical time, man. It really was.
Didn't Giant have a beer machine? I remember they had a soda machine that had beers in it. I might not remember that. I remember that being a teenager thinking that was very cool. Being 16, and it's like, oh, I can just put $1 in this and get a beer.
That probably exists nowhere right now. Like, that is just like things that could. It's like there's a long list of things that could happen in the 80s and early 90s that literally you would have like black helicopters and people, in Kevlar, fucking, raiding your place if you ever thought about doing it. So, everybody kind of went their own separate ways, stayed in music, and some of you guys got, different jobs. And, I mentioned this, previously as we were talking on another time, but, Pat, you got a job that's pretty much the most straight edge job that anybody could possibly have. So, what did you do and what are you doing now?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I actually worked for the FBI for a few years in New York City in the Foreign Counterintelligence Division, and and now I work for the DEA in Philadelphia, and I've been there now for almost 23 years. So it's, I ended up, again, getting a career in federal law enforcement, which was kind of 180 degrees from the scene. But it's been a blast, man. It's been an absolute blast.
Well, I just still picture your shit-eating grin as you're freaking have this adrenaline rush of jumping on the crowd. And I can imagine that, some of the things you do provide a similar rush. I mean, you're a bike messenger too. So I know that you may not have any drugs in your system, but you like the adrenaline a little bit, I think.
Oh, no question. And in some ways, we have just as much fun in our group or a squad room as we did with the band, except when we get pulled over by the cops now, it's not nearly as scary.
And so, Steve, kind of like, what did you do for a job after Uppercut and kind of prior to King's Destroy and kind of, how did hardcore impact kind of the way that you conducted business?
I got a job in operations, the most basic, lowest tier job you could get at Merrill Lynch. And I think I was making $18,500 a year, which is why I had to live in the Bronx. And, I just kind of got lucky. I was in the right place, right time, and ended up having a pretty long career as a bond trader. Ended up moving overseas for a few years. But for me, there wasn't really a conflict. To me, it was just like anybody else, really. I was out of college. My family was not close by, and I had to pay my bills, and everything that came after that was gravy. You know what I mean? So I just kind of fell into it. I mean, I think I always kind of had that mentality that I would like to do that, but I really just fell into it and worked out, I guess.
Cool. And Lars, you bounced around a little bit, but now you found your way back to the entertainment biz, right?
Yeah, I bounced around once again, but I've worked as an entertainment lawyer for over a decade now. And I just left the last gig I had, and I'm sort of figuring out what I'm going to do next. So
I think, as I said in the beginning, hardcore gave me a sense of entrepreneurship, right? It gave me the fact that you can do anything if you do it. Like, I never thought I could start a record company, and I did. And, it amazingly has given me jobs, in many different ways. And I still do the label after this many years. And I'm astonished, that people still want to buy the reissues of stuff that I did 30 years ago. So it's a gratifying experience for me. You guys chime into kind of what you brought forward from those days.
I think when I think about that stuff, there's two things about because I was, fairly young. We're talking about the ages of 16 to 18 for me, or a little bit later, 16 to 19. And having something as a teenager that's completely yours, that there's basically no adult supervision, is pretty remarkable. Now having teenagers that are, my sons are teenagers, and like they're pretty independent, but they still never had anything like being in, the Tom Sawyer aspects of being in a hardcore band where you get to go to Boston for the weekend, then you go back to regular high school. Like that just, most kids just don't experience it. I mean, they could, maybe you'd say you're on a traveling baseball team or the basketball team or something, but that's all like adult supervised and, sanctioned and pretty normal. And I got to experience something that is completely by kids and done for kids and, basically totally for, just for the love of it. And there's very few things I've ever experienced since then. And that's what I take from that, is that's a pretty unique experience for any teenager to have.
I think that the whole idea of it's very contrarian. Hardcore is if you think about it in the larger context of music at that time, I mean, it was so far out there, now it seems much more mainstream, but at that time it was so far out there, and just that sort of contrarian nature of it. I feel like I've applied that in a lot of different ways. to various aspects of my life. And, obviously the memories are fantastic. And the fact that we're still making music all these years later is incredible. But also just the fact that like I can see Pat Traynor after not seeing him for 25 years, and there's just all this love there, and Lars and Rob, all these guys like you, Bill, Carl, guys from Breakdown and Killing Time. That is such a unique set of relationships, and probably in 1990 I took it for granted, but in 2021 you just realize how special it is to have friends for that length of time,
Sound design and mixing for Mad at the World is by Brad Worrell at Soundwag. Illustrations for each episode are by Christian Minnick. You can follow his art at Coretunes on Instagram. And if you like what we're doing, follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter at Blackout NYHC, and on Facebook and YouTube at Blackout Records. Got a comment or a suggestion for us? Hit us at MATW@blackoutrecords.com. See you next time. Gotta fight the hard way. There's always a way out.